Hi, welcome back. This is a video part two of a two-part series. So if you're just stumbling upon this video, you'll want to make sure and go back and watch my part one before we get to this. I want to show you the end product before I get into any new code today. This particular example is where we're looking at a nav bar on a basic computer size. I've already made it responsive so that when you shrink it down, my video part one showed how to put these buttons or make these buttons with CSS. This video is going to focus on this toggle button. We also call this the hamburger button because it looks like a hamburger, a patty between two buns. It's also referred to as the pancake button a lot of times, but it's kind of a universal symbol for navigation. And really what this is a toggle switch, so that when I click it, it hides the menu. When I click it again, it shows it. It toggles off and on and off and on. It'll do that indefinitely. So notice that when I'm on a larger screen than what's on a phone, there is no toggle switch, there is no navigation button. That only shows up when I shrink it down to a small size. And then at that point it becomes a clickable thing. Before we get started with code, I do want to point out that the hamburger button has been created already, and I've already saved it to my root folder. So if you don't have that created as a JPEG or a PNG, you'll want to go create that. Or you're certainly welcome to download one from the internet if there is a royalty-free site that you frequent. There are lots of these available. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. In my code, again, this is all from session 1. There's nothing new here. I've got essentially a navigation bar. And I'll have to add a little bit to this. We'll have to add an image tag for the hamburger button, as well as a little bit of JavaScript to make that work. Now I know JavaScript is not something we've looked at in my series, my video series on here, but we'll add a little bit, about 3 lines to make this thing work. If I go over to my CSS, this is also from the previous session. We've got essentially a nav bar, nav A, which are formatting the anchor tags for a big screen. And then I've got this media query that says, hey, for all small screens, change the way this looks. Make it so that these buttons go from this down to this. So visually, I'm only going to add that toggle button, that hamburger button here on the mobile view. And visually, not much else is going to change. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink this down to phone size. That's really the only thing we're concerned with. The first thing I want to do is to go to my HTML, and I'm going to have to insert some JavaScript. And JavaScript, if you're unaware, is a programming language. It's what's called a client-side language, so it's not a secure language. It's not something that you want to use to do any sort of personal credit card or social security, anything like that with. JavaScript is it's a programming language that is not secure. But we can do some really cool, fun, interactive stuff with it, like, well, make these toggle switches. So we can write our own JavaScript, but there's an awful lot of JavaScript that's already out there that does a phenomenal job for us. And there's one framework called jQuery, J-Q-U-E-R-Y. And in order for us to use this toggle option in JavaScript, we have to import jQuery. Now that typically is one line of code. It's a real ugly line of code that gets put in somewhere in the head of the document, typically after the CSS. Now in order to do that, we're going to go to jQuery.com. So I'll go jQuery.com, jQuery.com. Make sure you spell it exactly like that. If you spell it differently, it takes you to a completely different website with completely different things. So we're going to look for this big orange download jQuery button. And there's a lot of things I could say about jQuery, but here's what I'm going to do for this particular demo, just to keep it short and sweet. jQuery is already hosted on a number of web servers, including Google's, and we're just going to link to theirs. We're not going to download anything. We're not going to put anything in our folder. We can, but I'm just going to scroll down on jQuery.com, and then I click download. I'm going to scroll down until I see the section using jQuery with a CDN. A CDN, that is a hosted version of jQuery. I'm basically looking for Google, Microsoft, etc. And I'll go with Google. Can't go wrong there. And it gives you the lines of code you need to incorporate jQuery into your own site. Now again, this is just something we need to do to make that toggle switch work. So I'm only concerned with the 3.x snippet. Okay, we can use different versions of jQuery. The newest one is fine. I'm just going to copy that whole line, and I'm going to go back to my code, and I'm going to paste it. And it's a really long line of code, so it kind of goes off the screen there. I'm just going to paste it. The only thing you need to look at, the only thing you might need to change, is to make sure after src, make sure you see https:// there. Sometimes as a security measure, browsers will eliminate that from web addresses whenever you're copying and pasting. I'm using Chrome, and it seems to work just fine, but just FYI, make sure that HTTPS is there. That incorporates the library. Now I just have to add a little bit of code. Now I'll warn you in advance, this JavaScript is kind of ugly, but I am going to go ahead and do that now and kind of explain it as I go. Now in order to incorporate JavaScript, we're going to drop in the script tag. We copied and pasted the script tag above, and as a matter of fact, the closing script tag was way out here. Kind of goes off my screen a little bit, but it's there. And I'm going to do another opening and closing script tag with some room for code in between. Now, jQuery is a framework that allows us the ability to locate things within our document. And jQuery code almost always starts with this line of code, and it's an ugly line, but it is a good one. $. Every time you see $. In JavaScript, it's generally referring to jQuery. As a matter of fact, we can actually replace that with the word jQuery. So most coders, instead of saying $document, are going to say jQuery document ready. So what this is saying is find the thing called document, or find the document, since there's no quotes around it. It's saying find the entire page. And when the page is ready, do a function. Now a function, if you're not aware, is simply a group of code. It's a group of code that doesn't happen, it doesn't execute until I tell it to execute. So all this line is doing is just saying, hey, when the page is loaded, when the document's ready, when this thing is loaded from the internet into memory, do these next few lines of code. Do this function. This is just typical jQuery. I don't think I've ever used jQuery without using this line that basically just tells all of our code, hold on, don't do anything until you're told. So inside of that, we're going to add in a couple of things here. We're going to say $, quote, and I'm going to call this, I'm going to call it Hamburger. It's kind of a fun name for it. So what I'm saying here is find the thing with the ID of Hamburger. So we're going to create something down here in a few minutes. It's going to have an ID of Hamburger. Find the thing called Hamburger, and when it is clicked, do this function. So here's the word function again. Do this block of code. And I'm going to go down a couple of lines and put in the other closing tags. So this function opens here and closes here. This parenthesis opens here and closes down here. And then this bigger function, when the page loads, opens here, closes here. When the document is ready, opens there and closes there. So this is sort of like a big nested block of JavaScript. We've got one more line, and I promise we're done with JavaScript. We're going to say find the thing called nav, so find our nav bar, and do something called toggle class hide. Now, I'll go back and explain this later in this video, but every time you see $, it says find the document, find the thing called, or the thing that has an ID of hamburger, find the nav bar, and do something to it. And essentially what's going to happen is when we click the hamburger button, we're going to find the nav bar and hide it. Now the word toggle means to turn on and off, sort of like a light switch. You can turn it on, you can turn it off, you can turn it on, you can turn it off. So we're basically going to say hide the nav and then don't hide the nav, and then hide the nav and don't hide the nav. That's what toggling does. So this is a really ugly way in JavaScript to say, hey, when the page loads and when somebody clicks the hamburger button, toggle the hide button on the nav bar. So we're going to have to create some sort of class that makes it hide. Toggle class, that's talking about a CSS class, and please note that C there is uppercase. Toggle class is a jQuery function, needs to be typed just like that. So the good news is we're actually done with the JavaScript. Now if I save it and refresh it at this point, not going to see any difference whatsoever. There's nothing at all that this has done to the visual aspect. But when I go down here to the body, I do want to insert my image tag. Now it's a regular old image tag, and I don't even have this in any specific folder or anything. I've just got it right inside of my root folder for this demo. I'm going to plug it in as hamburger.jpg, and I'm going to give it an ID of hamburger. And here's why. It's so important to give this an ID. When you give an ID to an element in HTML, it means that's the only thing on this entire page that can be called hamburger. So if I make a div later, if I make another button, anything at all that I call hamburger, it's not going to work because the ID of hamburger is already reserved for this image. There can only be one ID of hamburger per page, and I'm taking it right now. And the reason that's important is because my JavaScript is then going to say, hey, find the thing called hamburger, and when it's clicked, do something. Well, how does it know what hamburger is? Because only one thing has an ID of hamburger. So by giving this an ID, we're saying this is the hamburger button. This is the menu button. And when we go up to our JavaScript, we're saying, hey, find the menu button. So that's kind of what connects these two. ID and pound sign or hashtag essentially mean the same thing. This is the HTML syntax. This is the JavaScript and the CSS syntax. So right off the bat, if we save that, we take it back out and look at our large view, we got a couple of problems. First of all, I'm seeing it on my large view, which I don't want to do. I don't want to see this on the large view at all. We'll have to hide that with CSS in a moment. On my small view, it's the same thing. It's gigantic, and that's the actual size of the image, and that's okay. I do see my navigation button. When I click it right now, nothing's happening. That's okay. I haven't actually completed the code yet. But the first thing I really want to do is to make this thing so that it's not gigantic. And the easiest way to do that is to simply come into my image tag here and add the width attribute. And I'm going to make it, I'm going to say 40. Now this is HTML code, not CSS, so you don't need the PX or the semicolon. Just width equals 40. It'll know to do that in pixels. It'll adjust the height accordingly, and that's cool. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that. And I think that's probably all we're going to have to do to the HTML. Everything else is going to be done now in CSS. So I know I'm going to have to do something to make a class called hide, because I've got this toggle class here. I'm also going to have to do something to hide that button on this view. I don't want it to be viewed at all. So first things first, let's go over our CSS. Again, all this CSS was completed in a previous video in part 1, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. The first thing I really want to do here is to go up towards the top. I don't want to go into the media query. I want to make a generic CSS rule called hide. a generic rule called hide, and the only thing that it's going to get is display none. Display of none is a magic CSS property and value that will hide something. It's still there, it's still in code, it's not deleted, it's just hidden. So by making this class called display of none, I've created a CSS rule that I can now toggle for the menu, so that when I click the hamburger button, the nav should hide. And I think we'll see some results already. If we refresh this, I come back here and I click it, and now my navigation is gone. I click it again and it's revealed. Click it again, it's gone. So this is truly a toggle switch. So that part's working pretty well. I only have one last thing to do, and that is to get rid of this on my large computer version. So I want it to show up on the regular, or on the smartphone version, but not here on the computer version. So what I'm going to do is go back to my CSS, and I'm actually going to write a little media query for large computers, for anything larger than a phone. Now you can put the media queries wherever you want. I'm going to go ahead and go all the way to the bottom. So after my media query for smartphones closes, I've got nothing down here at the bottom. I'm all the way at the end. And I'm going to do a @media screen and instead of maximum width, I'm going to do a minimum width of 481 pixels. Now you might remember that the media query we did for our phones is up to 480. So maximum of 480, up to 480. This is saying at least 481. So anything larger than smartphone size is going to get this. Now inside this media query, I don't need to do a ton of stuff. I'm simply going to do something for my hamburger. The ID of hamburger. And all I'm going to add here is a display of none. Same property we did just a few moments ago. But all we're seeing now is the hamburger button, that graphic, hide it. Display of none only on big screens. By adding this media query in there, all I'm really doing is saying, hey look, I don't want you to show up on a large screen. So if I go back to my browser, refresh it, hey, on large screen, there's no hamburger button. Shrink it down a little bit, and it does show up on my mobile device because it's only hidden, it's only displayed of none on large devices, anything larger than 481. So when I get larger than 481, it's hidden. When I get smaller than 480, it's available, and I can toggle that on and off. So of course you can add any other formatting to this. You can obviously do this in the context of your own designs. So feel free to experiment with all of that. All of this navigation is hidden. So if we go back to that JavaScript to summarize this really quick, document ready function is basic jQuery that says, hey, don't do any of this code until it's told to. That starts there and ends there. So what code is going to execute? Well, when we find the thing, it's what $, find the thing with the ID of hamburger, .click. So when the hamburger ID is clicked, do this function of code, do this block of code. And that block of code starts with function and it ends with that closing parenthesis. Opens here, closes there. So what's it going to do whenever we click? Find the nav bar and toggle the hide class. So hide it and unhide it. If by chance you've got a design where you've got more than one nav bar, that is possible, then you'll have to decide which nav bar you want to hide and give it an ID. You can replace this with an ID if you choose. So for example, if I had two nav bars, maybe I would just give them an ID of nav1 and nav2. Down here on my nav, I could simply say ID nav1, and it would give me the same result. Now, I'm not going to add a second nav. I just want to show that still works. As long as this guy right here and this ID name match, that's all that matters. So if there's no ID, move it back to the way I had it. If there's no ID, if that's the only nav on your page, then you certainly don't need to put the hashtag or the pound. We could just say find the nav tag and hide it. So hopefully that demystifies some of the confusion about creating a mobile navigation system. There's a lot more you can do with this, but this is a great place to start. If the JavaScript code is freaking you out, don't let it. There's so much to JavaScript. There's courses and courses and courses you can take on JavaScript, and I'm under the firm belief that you don't have to recreate the wheel. If something's been done 1,000 times, there's no reason to go out and try to code it yourself. I did this from memory because I've done it a whole bunch of times, but this is a pretty standard way to do the hamburger button. So hopefully that helps out a little bit. As always, if you have a question, shoot me an email or leave me a message. Thanks for viewing.